Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. You can find us on YouTube. What you need to do is you need to search my name, Linda Maria Frank, and just click on my picture and all of the videos will come up. We've interviewed about 150 different authors, and if you like to read or if you're interested in writing, you're going to find some very interesting books. Most of our talent is local, Long Island talent. You can also find us here on ltv-eh.org, video on demand. Use the pull-down menu to find The Writer's Dream and click on the episodes. We're also on Facebook if you're interested in asking a question or being on the show. Please message me through the Facebook page. It's called The Writer's Dream. Today we are interviewing Genie Henderson, and she has written A Day Like No Other. She is a local person from Springs, and she's lived out here for how many years, Genie?
Ooh, 35.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're going to find this book very interesting. Our host today is Jack Bilello. He's been our host before, and he is the author of Bonds of War, Heart of a Lion, I Still Love Joni James, and American Patrol. So, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to start welcoming you, Jeannie. I have to tell you that once I picked up your book, I couldn't put it down.
Oh, that's
and I really enjoyed it thoroughly and learned. Not only was it entertaining and informative, but boy, I learned all about that period of September 21st, 1938, the day of that great Hamptons hurricane. As I said, the difference between your books and the 4 books that Linda mentioned is that people have said that once they put my book down, they can't pick it up again. So I think that's really a tribute to the interest that you've had in your book. I'd like to start by something unusual, because you triggered a memory flashback for me in reading it. It had nothing to do with the hurricane.
Yeah.
In one of the segments of the book, you have Wilma preparing lunch for her son, Louis. Mm-hmm. And she makes a tomato sandwich with mayonnaise.
Yes.
Sliced tomato with mayonnaise. And I remember my grandmother, and I loved, especially when it got soggy.
Oh,
I tell you.
Yeah.
So you've given me a lot of thoughts about food writing this book, but you also gave me a lot of food for thought. And I think that is really neat. So let me start by asking you, in a day like any other, there are, as you know, there are components of writing a novel. There's the character, the setting, and the plot. And I've always felt that the character is very important, but you have to have a good story, and you have a great story. Do you have any preference in terms of the development of your novel of character, plot, and setting? The setting reads itself. It's Hamptons in the summer of, and then that fateful day of September 21st, 1938.
Yeah. For me, characters are my driving, force. Plot is very difficult, but as you say, I had a great plot because I had that storm, and that storm really is a character in the book as well. I mean, I feel the storm is a character, but I love characters, and out here, there are characters abounding. It was not difficult to come up with the characters that are in the book, but I just want to step back a little bit and say that we all know that the hurricane actually happened. Every fact of the hurricane in the book is real. So there's not one story that happened to anyone that wasn't a real story that was either based on that particular hurricane, or I did borrow a few stories from other storms, 1 or 2. But all the characters are completely fictional or kind of composite characters of people I've come across in my 35 years being lucky enough to live in this beautiful community.
Some of the characters, like for example, Jack Burns and Walter Penn.
Yeah.
Very, very artistic. And are you, is your interest in the arts conveyed in the book, and is that really something that you love and enjoy?
Well, it's interesting. My interest in artists, we live in Springs, and that, of course, was the epicenter of the great abstract expressionist movement. So you can't really live in Springs without knowing a lot about that group of artists, which were romantic and intoxicating to me. I mean, great stories. I don't know very much about art at all, but I've always envied it. I always thought it was this great, mysterious, wonderful world, and I've always wished I was an artist. And if I ever got to meet an artist, and I've had many friends who are artists, I see them as kind of these mystical people. So I kind of hold them up in a way that, you know, is intriguing to me. But I don't know much about the art world.
Well, you could fool me, because because the way you express light and color and shade and form, I thought you were an artist.
Oh.
I really did.
Oh,
I mean,
I'm
I
so
said, well, this
flattered, yeah.
woman really, and much more than I would ever know about art. So some of the characters, you know, one of the things that I came away with is that how, even though they were wealthy, Emmeline and Judy Tate and Walter, they were not happy with their lives.
Yeah.
They were
Yeah.
very wealthy and had a lot of status and privilege, but there was something lacking. They were bored, and something was missing.
Something was missing, and
Yeah.
they had the most conflicts as the book moved along. In deciding on the characters, I really didn't get very creative at all. I wanted somebody from each pocket of life out here. The fishing families, the Bonnickers, the native people. Wilma and her friend, they are called upstreeters. They were local people, but they were the people, the professional people that lived in town. And then there, of course, were the summer people that were out there in their grand houses and giving the grand parties, as you mentioned. But as the book moves, well, the book is bookended. It starts the morning of the storm. And the reason it's called A Day Like Any Other is because nobody knew it was coming. And to me, that was the real reason I wrote the book. I was so intrigued with that at what point did people start to realize that this was not just any old storm, that this was something else? Because hurricanes hadn't happened up here for over 100 years before then. And local people said they never even heard the word hurricane. I mean, it was something that happened down in the Caribbean, something that maybe happened in Florida, but it was never a word that was applied to any sort of weather condition in this part of the world. So the fact that it's the largest storm that's ever hit New England. The fact that that storm came in at 3 o'clock with no warning whatsoever was magical to me as a plot device.
Sure.
You know.
And there was that one meteorologist who did give a warning. Is that true?
That's true.
That is true. And his boss kind of sloughed him off.
It sloughed him off, yeah.
You know, I found a little connection between circumstances that exist today with climate change. There are those who deny it and say, "Oh, it's nothing. It's it's a hoax, etc." And there are those who are saying, "Hey, come on, fellas, we have to be ready for this." And did you have a conscious connection there between the meteorologist and his boss who denied what was going on and what's happening today?
That was yes, definitely. I think the underlying, between the lines message that comes out of reading this book is how vulnerable we all are, all across the world, but particularly out here and on the coastlines, how vulnerable we are and how this global warming is really how it can affect us. But that story about the weather, that is, I did change the names, but it's almost exactly as it happened. And I was lucky enough to find some really good reports about that. He was a junior in the department. He was the only one that took put the two and two together. And when he made his presentation to the rest of the Weather Bureau, they poo-pooed it and they said, you know, there's never been a hurricane up in this parts of the world. They all die in colder waters. Well, that summer was hot and those waters were warm.
Day like no other.
Yeah. And in the end, he got promoted.
He did.
And the
boss
boss
guy was
the boss
forced to
got fired.
resign.
Yes. So that's very true, yeah.
That is very good. One of the references I enjoyed thoroughly, sporadically thought, is your reference to, for example, Erskine Caldwell. You mentioned Erskine Caldwell. I don't think Erskine Caldwell has been mentioned in years, and yet in his time, things like Tobacco Road was a sensation.
Yeah.
Right? Guy's Little Acre.
Yeah,
And so on. How did you bring that into the novel?
Well, that's kind of interesting because, you know, I wrote a novel prior to this that was based on the life of Margaret Bourke-White, and although I fictionalized it. And Margaret Bourke-White was married to Erskine Caldwell. So I'm from the South, so I
Okay,
wanted to
that's
get, you know, a little bit of, because Jack, my artist, he's from the South. And I wanted to get a little, you know, Southern vibe in there. But yeah, you're right. Erskine Caldwell was considered the next Faulkner.
Yeah, he was.
And even Faulkner said, "This is my heir apparent." And now he's just completely and totally gone. Yeah.
I remember my father loved Erskine Caldwell. They made a movie, Tobacco Road.
Yes.
And he dragged me to see that movie in the 40s. I think I was a kid. They made a movie, Tobacco Road.
Yeah.
And he dragged me to see that movie, and I said, but I was so young, I couldn't appreciate it.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
But you also, knowing now that you came from the South, you know, now I see why Margaret Mitchell is mentioned in there too. Gone with the Wind. You mentioned Gone with the Wind and the Great Atlanta story and the Civil War. And the Civil War story, because you do bring those references into the book very, very effectively.
Yeah.
From a historical point, you do make reference to, of course, it was 1938, so the Depression is still there. It's kind of, you know, not as serious as it was in the early days in the 31, 32, 33, but by 37, 38, and 39, the Depression was still having an effect and an impact on the country. So that is brought into the novel in an effective way, I think, too. And you mentioned, you know, Hitler and Czechoslovakia. That's when, you know, when the Chamberlain gave up, you know, what we call now appeasement. You know, so that is just, but it's an effective way of doing it because you don't dwell on it because it's not really the story. But when I read it, I go, of course, 1938, Hitler, Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain, and so on. And that was good. That was very, very good.
You know, it's interesting that the day of the hurricane was the day Hitler marched into Czechoslovakia. So even though this hurricane was front page news for about 2 days, what was happening in Europe was far more important, and it got pushed off the news. And in a matter of years, of course, we were in the war. And then after the war, of course, there was the whole, you know, post-war life and everything. And this hurricane was kind of forgotten. It was forgotten for a long, long time. And then finally, people started, you know, except it wasn't forgotten out here, or it wasn't forgotten by anybody who lived through it.
But, you know, it's interesting that you mention that because it makes me think that in 1938, the Hamptons were not what they are today.
No.
As far as people and, you know, the opportunity to come out here for the summer. And so now they're, as you say, Emmeline and Judy Tate and others. You know, they came out, they spent their summers, they had grand parties and so on. And so Errol Flynn, was he really, was Errol Flynn really at one of the parties? Oh, Errol Flynn, how could I miss that? but today it's like, you know, people from all over the world come to the Hamptons for the summer season. And you know, we're talking about Billy Joel and, you know, and
it's a whole different,
the whole, you know,
but in those days, of course, people came with their entourage and they opened these enormous estates and houses on the beach. And they stayed for the entire summer. There was none of this 2 weeks or just August or any of that kind of thing, and kind of group homes or any of the things that came later in the 50s and 60s. So it was, the summer colony was really a colony. They were an entity, and they were a force in town, and people depended on them. They depended on them for their, for work and for money and ways to get through the winter. So they were really part of the fabric of the place and how it worked out here.
I thought your use of foreshadowing was effective too, because, for example, for no reason, there's a window that is shattered from the inside out, and you say to yourself, "Uh-oh, what is this a sign of?" That was good. That was in, I think, Wilmer and Jim Palmer's house.
That was a true story told to me by somebody who was in their 80s. He was 7 years old, living in Massachusetts, and it happened to him and his family. And I remember when he told me that story. Well, that's another thing when you're working on your characters and on the stories, and reading real events, real things that happened. You can read maybe 5 or 6 stories, but one of them, you see it. You see the characters, you feel it. And when he told me that story, I immediately wrote in a 7-year-old boy and his family having breakfast, and that all those characters came out of that one story.
Also, Judy Tate, on the day of the storm, is having a party for her little 4-year-old child, and the pony would not get on, and you say, "Uh-oh." That's a sign too of something. The weather vane that goes through the school and breaks the school window was the sign that the teacher's saying, "Hey, this is serious." So all of these things kind of build up to the tension and the importance of what's going to happen. You made some good historical reference other than Hitler. You talk about the Dust Bowl, because that was prominent in the 30s. You talk about FDR and the bread lines. And here's something, though, that I was curious to see if this is true. You say that FDR, the bread lines, the Dust Bowl, and you say the Democrats, all bad. Well, I beg your pardon.
I know. That was tough for me to write, I'll have to say. But this was a hardcore Republican community, especially amongst the working people, the fishermen and the farmers and the local people. So, they didn't like FDR. I came from a big FDR family.
And that's
Loved
in
it.
Alabama and in Mississippi. That's interesting.
Yeah. And they were, I heard stories about people who didn't like FDR and how hostile they were towards him, which I found almost hard to believe, because to me he's a saint, and he's extraordinary. But it's interesting you picked up on that. That was just one little line.
Also, for example, historically, there was so much opposition of the wealthy and privileged class to FDR. They called him a traitor to his own class, because he came from a privileged family. And there was an attempt by Wall Street. It's called the Wall Street Putsch, which like an attempt to seize power. And there was a group of people, conspirators in Wall Street, who wanted a Marine Corps general by the name of Smedley Butler, who was the only one in the history of our country to be awarded 2 Medals of Honor, to take over the government.
Wow.
And Smedley Butler said, no. If you try this, I'll come after you. And it squelched this Wall Street Putsch.
Wow.
So that was, you're right, FDR did meet with a lot of opposition. But he was also considered to be one of our three greatest presidents from the historical record. I like the way you mentioned Thoreau and his urgent message to simplify life. You use that. Simplify. How tough it is, though. Right? How difficult it is.
How difficult it is.
And I was so delighted to find out, surprising, that Thoreau was in love with Emerson's wife. Now, where did you find that? Where did you find this out?
That's a great story. I know that story. I want to hear it. He was definitely in love with her. That whole life up there. Maybe that's the next novel. I don't know.
That was and that transcendentalist movement of Thoreau, and of which Emerson and Thoreau probably exemplified the best of it, said that most people live lives of quiet, desperation.
Yeah.
I thought about that, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure I believe it, but I say, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And in your book, you almost find that the wealthy and the privileged, they are not immune
Yeah.
to a life of quiet desperation.
No.
They're not
Yeah.
happy.
Yeah.
They are desperately certain. They're bored.
Yeah.
They're bored,
Yeah.
even though they have parties and socials and this and that.
Yeah.
They're not living a productive and complete and contributing life.
Yeah.
And I thought
True.
that was quite
Yeah.
quite interesting too. That was good. One of the things that it reminded me, your book reminded me of, that Thoreau at Walden Pond was much against the Mexican War of 1846, 1848, and refused to pay taxes.
Oh, good
Refused
for
to pay
him.
taxes. They put him in jail.
Yeah.
Thoreau went to jail, and when his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson came to visit him in jail, Ralph Waldo said, Henry David, what are you doing in there?
Yeah.
And Thoreau said, the question, Ralph, is, what are you doing
Out
out there? I thought that was,
That's
and that
good.
the book did remind me of those transcendentalists who wanted to live a simple life, Walden Pond,
Yeah.
but a meaningful and productive life. So they were against that
Right.
Mexican war and
Yeah.
felt that it was a war of aggression
Yeah.
and so on. So that was really, really, really good. So, as I said, I like in the structure of your book, each chapter has a heading, and you have some interesting quotes there. You're quoting William Carlos Williams, and you're quoting, other. How did you come up, of course, that idea to effectively start each chapter?
Well, it just kind of happened. You find one quote. I think the very first one I found was that Woody Guthrie about
yes.
about the storm and the ocean rolling on its weary way and everything. And I thought, well, I want to use that. And if I'm going to use that, maybe I can find one for this, and then it became a game.
Yeah, it was great.
It's
It was great.
a
I
wonderful
loved the way
game
each
to-
chapter started. You said, that was
Yeah.
a terrific idea.
Yeah.
A terrific idea. So that was really good.
Yeah.
The names of some of the characters. Now, some of them are standard names. Jack Burns. When I write my books, I don't want to use a name like Jones and Smith.
Yeah.
I'm trying to use interesting names.
Right,
For
right.
example, the protagonist of my first novel is Jesse Van Twelves. You don't see names like that, but it is a name.
Yeah.
I found the World War II fighter pilot who was like our 9th leading ace of
Wow.
World War II, whose name was Van Twelves. I said, well, that's unusual.
There's
And
a
I
name.
think that's something,
Yeah.
Leyendecker, the guy who taught Jack Burns
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
Art League and
yeah.
so on and so forth. One of my favorite characters was Waldo Leyendecker from the movie Laura with Clifton Webb. Waldo Leyendecker.
Well,
You don't see
Leyendecker,
names like that.
Leyendecker in the book was real. He was the real.
Yeah,
the
as is
thing.
Thomas Moran.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about Thomas Moran? Because he
Well-
was apparently, in his time, exceptionally famous. He had
Oh, he was.
Metropolitan Museum, etc. His wife lived out here. His daughter lived out
Right,
here.
they lived right on Main Street. They've been restoring the house. It's now restored. Thomas Moran built that house out of spare parts that he brought out from the city, from old factories and different things like that. But they were really the first artists to come out here. And because of them, other artists came. The Tile Club came. And because of that, it became an art colony, which has never let up. We're still an art colony, lo these many years later. But they came out in about 1880, and their life was just beautiful and bucolic. And I wanted to write about them. And so Walter Penn, as a young boy, knew Mrs. Moran, who was
Yes.
also an artist,
And-
and that's how he got into the art world.
And she
So-
died from typhus or typhoid during the Spanish-American War period. And you point this out in the book that Teddy Roosevelt
Teddy Roosevelt
and his
had brought,
Rough Riders
brought
came
all
out
his,
to Montauk after the war and trained out there. And
Well, they
and
came out
mustered.
there because they were sick, and he needed a place that was on the coast that he could get his sick troops to, and it had to be a place that was not populated, and Montauk was completely empty then, except for sheep and cows being herded out there. So Montauk was absolutely perfect, and they have miles of these tents. The typhoid did come to East Hampton, and Mary Moran died.
Died in
Yeah.
like 1899.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
really. And that the interesting thing that I thought was that the Walter Penn, he is a man of great interest in. He wanted to see the ocean, and he goes out during the storm.
Yeah.
To
yeah.
look at the ocean.
Well,
And
many people
It was
did.
like a tsunami that came in. It was like a wall.
A wall of water
not-
came in,
yeah.
but it was coming so fast. That's the other thing about the storm that one has to. Most storms move between 4 and 12 miles an hour. That one was moving at 65 miles an hour, fastest moving storm
Ever.
And it came with such a force. But all day, people had been going to the ocean to look at the waves, and they were saying they were beauties, they were wonderful, you can't miss these waves, and people are standing on the dunes. And a lot of people lost their lives because they were there when the wall of water came in.
Over 800 people.
Well, 800 people not here on Long Island.
But
we lost fewer than Rhode
Connecticut,
Island and
Rhode Island, as it
Connecticut.
swept across.
It swept
yeah.
across, yeah. But the waves that came ashore on our beach were 50 feet tall,
Yeah.
and they were recorded on seismographs in Alaska.
Wow. Well, we
So-
only have a few seconds remaining.
Yo, all right.
So quickly, that's
yeah.
it. When you're having a good time, it flies, right?
Right, yeah.
But what is your next project? Do you have a next project in mind? I mean, you had mentioned something.
Well, I'm actually very interested in the artists that were here in the 40s and 50s. And I'm working on maybe writing about them. And
Good.
some of the characters from this novel will come back in. It's not a sequel,
Well,
but some
I
of
am
the
looking
characters will
forward
reappear.
to reading that, because as I said, I thoroughly enjoyed this, and thank
Yeah.
you very much. I
Thank
enjoyed
you.
this interview more than you did, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank
It was
you.
fun.